What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of In Search of Answers. This is the series where you all ask me questions, and I do my very best to answer them. We got a bunch of great questions to get into today. As a reminder, if you would like to send in a question to be potentially answered here on the show, you can do that by just leaving a comment here on YouTube, and I'll do my best to get to it. Or if you are a subscriber on Patreon, you can head over to Patreon, find the listing for this episode there, and inside that listing, there will be a link to a form that you can fill out because patrons get first crack at having their questions answered here on the show. And also, as a reminder, these don't have to be about WoW. I think all of them today are about WoW, but I've seen a couple people saying things like, well, this isn't really about WoW, but blah, blah, blah. Like, that's fine. You can ask me questions about anything gaming, tech, etc. related here on the show. Feel free to ask me any questions you can come up with, and I will do my best to answer them. All right, let's get started. First question for today comes from Shark over on Patreon, who said, do you feel like Torghast as an idea should be revisited? I feel that the idea behind it was very good, but the end product was hindered by requiring it for character power. If they added another Torghast-style system with only cosmetic rewards and an actual challenge, it would be regarded with the same reverence as the Mage Tower is. So this is actually a topic that I've been bringing up a few times more recently, especially like looking towards Delves in the War Within. The concept of rewards eventually have a way of ruining gameplay that's otherwise fun if it's not done properly. So Torghast is a prime example of this. There are other examples from the past, things like Ashran, for example, back in the Warlords of Draenor beta. People loved playing Ashran, and then they put rewards into it, and the way to get those rewards adjusted people's gameplay in such a way that Ashran was no longer fun. So the rewards that are given for a type of content can very much directly affect the gameplay aspect, to the extent that you kind of, like, I'm always a little bit nervous when Blizzard or anyone is adding a new style of gameplay to something, and they clearly have a gameplay loop in mind, and they haven't included rewards as part of that gameplay loop, assuming that it's a game where rewards is a thing. If you don't include what those rewards are from the start and how those rewards are earned from the start for a type of gameplay, inevitably what happens later on is they feel like they get shoehorned in some capacity, or you kind of think, we'll give people rewards for doing something in here. And then that something in there ends up being the focus for what players end up doing. That's the primary thing that they're focused on, is getting those rewards at that point, because it feels like rewards, when you add rewards to something, players tend to subconsciously feel like that's almost subtly telling you what you're supposed to be doing, right? So if you have a type of gameplay that you're implementing, and you say, okay, if you do this thing, then you get X currency or cosmetic item or player power or whatever it is, players then feel like the point of that item or that point of that gameplay loop is to do that thing, right? That ends up feeling like that's the focus of the gameplay element. So Torghast is a great example here, because in the original Shadowlands Alpha, Torghast was super fun. People loved Torghast. There were a lot of people who were really, really into Torghast. And I remember, like, early on, a lot of streamers were like just trying to push Torghast to see how far they could get, see what like levels they could get to in it, how high they could push the level of Torghast that they were doing, because this was before a few redesigns for the system. They were trying to just get as far as they could in it, and they felt great, because occasionally it was something where, like, they just got this crazy, ridiculous run, and they were doing these absurd things and just destroying everything around them. And they were like, yeah, but it's fine because the rewards aren't really that important, and it's not like it's breaking anything. The problem was that then Blizzard felt that there needed to be a reward added to this, and they even put some player power rewards in there, which then meant that everyone who would have otherwise looked at Torghast and been like, yeah, not the gameplay that I'm looking for, I'm not interested, then felt forced into doing it, which in turn had the like secondary effect after that of, now that there are people who feel like they're forced into doing this content and genuinely really were like they really did. This is hard to say for some reason. They really did force players into doing Torghast. I know a lot of times that term tends to be taken as like, well, you're not really forced to do it, but like, if you wanted to play Shadowlands, you had to do Torghast. There was no alternative method there. There was no saying, well, I don't really have to. Like, no, you had to do Torghast, at least a little bit. You had to do Torghast. And as a result, then they needed to make the experience of doing Torghast less frustrating for those people that wouldn't have wanted to be there in the first place, which meant that a lot of the initial essence, the gameplay that people really loved about Torghast, for the people that loved it, before the rewards were added in. For the people that loved it, some of that had to get taken away and some of that had to get removed so that it was less frustrating for the people who otherwise would have just passed on Torghast entirely and just said, you know what? Yeah, not for me, not what I'm looking for. I don't want to play that. But then they had to. So Blizzard needed to cater to that audience somewhat. And that had a tendency to, like, as things went on over the course of Shadowlands, just kind of turn Torghast less into some fun thing that you could go do if you were excited about it and if you enjoyed it. It turned it into just this job that everyone had to do a little bit of every single week. And there wasn't really any need to aim for anything higher than that. And I don't think necessarily that, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in the next topic as well, but I don't think that only cosmetic rewards really solves that problem either. Like, making the rewards only be cosmetic doesn't necessarily solve the issue. Like, look at Plunderstorm, for example. The number of people who hated Plunderstorm, but they wanted to look like a pirate. So they did Plunderstorm anyway. They were miserable the entire time because it just wasn't a game mode that they enjoyed, but they wanted to look like a pirate. So they felt like they had to do it anyway in order to get this thing. The incentive for doing it was strong enough that it pulled them into doing something they didn't want to do. And I know a lot of people have been like, well, if you don't want to do it, then just don't do it. Again, I don't think it's not that simple, right? It's not that simple. There's a lot of things that I don't want to do, but I do them anyway because I feel like I need to. Like, just in life, I don't want to, like, I need to go power wash the side of my house because there's been some buildup, like some dust has gotten up onto it after some recent rains that we had. I don't want to go do that. That's boring, but I'm going to because I want my house to look nice. Sorry for bumping into the microphone. I want my house to look nice, so I'm going to go power wash the side of my house, but I'm going to be bored in the process and I'm not going to enjoy doing it. I'm not going to go power wash my house just because I felt like power washing my house. The same sort of concept applies to things like Torghast and to Plunderstorm more recently, where if the rewards, even if cosmetic, if the rewards are attractive enough to people, they will still go and do that. And because it's a video game, they're naturally going to expect to have fun in the process. So when the rewards are cool and the gameplay isn't fun, that's a problem. Now, that's not an entirely, but in some cases that's unavoidable, right? Like there do need to be, especially in this day and age, there needs to be a reward for most types of video games, especially ones as progression focused as MMORPGs. There needs to be a reward on the end of it, or players just inherently feel like they're wasting their time as a result. Like, I don't necessarily think that people would have continued to do Torghast if it was just there and there was no point to it. People would have been like, well, maybe I'll get to it eventually if it's fun, but they'd do it a few times and then they just wouldn't do it anymore, because even if they enjoyed the gameplay, because it would feel like a waste of time when they're playing World of Warcraft compared to other things that are available to them. So this is a very difficult issue to solve, to be clear. Like, there isn't a perfect answer to this, I don't think. That said, getting back to the essence of the current question, I would love to see Torghast be revisited. Again, back in the alpha days, it was super, super fun. Maybe this could be an idea for another one of these limited time events that Blizzard's been doing, things like the Mop Remix, things like Plunderstorm. Maybe some sort of like return to Torghast idea could be in there, where it's like, hey, here's a limited time event. We're going to have Torghast available. We're going to mix it up in some ways so it is once again back to that feeling of a roguelike, I'm just going to do one more run and see if I can get farther next time sort of thing, and turn that into something that people can go ham on if they want, or they can walk away from if they don't, and it's not directly influencing player power. I would love to see something like that. I would love to see them pull something like that out and explore that idea for a future idea. I just think it's important to say that just the fact that it only has cosmetic rewards isn't necessarily inherently going to mean it's something that people just ignore if they don't feel like it. I think the Mage Tower actually is it's an interesting example to use here, because a lot of people obviously said, well, I'm not going to do the Mage Tower, but that was more because the Mage Tower was very difficult, at least at the time. And so those players looked at the Mage Tower stuff and said, yeah, that's just not happening. And thus were able to strike that idea out of their mind entirely. Like, I'm not going to get that reward. So I'm not going to get that reward. I will not be able to complete this. I am not going to get that reward. That's a little bit different than something like Plunderstorm or like Torghast even, where it was at the very least something that if you just kept at it and you kept grinding, even if you were miserable the entire time and it took you 5 times longer than someone else who is better at it than you are, it was still a reward that you could conceivably get. And I feel like that distinction is actually relatively important for designs like this. But again, for me, it largely comes down to the notion of the reward structure needs to be a part of the design from the beginning It needs to flow through the entire concept of how the gameplay actually comes together. Because if you take something fun that you haven't thought about rewards for yet, and then you try to add a reward structure into it after the fact, what you're going to do is change how players approach the fun thing that you've created in the first place. Or at the very least, there's a very high risk of that occurring. So that, I think, is ultimately the problem that Torghast had. Again, it's a problem that Ashran had. It's a problem that Plunderstorm had more recently. I would just love to see, I would love to see a little bit more thought put into how is the reward structure going to work as part of the actual gameplay experience when they're actually first pitching these ideas and coming up with it. It needs to be built into the concept from the beginning, because adding it in later just causes problems. Anyway, we're going to move on. Like I said before, we do have a somewhat similar question. This is the next one from Moshfront on YouTube, who said, why do you think Blizzard doesn't want to make hero talents cosmetic or class skin only? If Covenants in Shadowlands were like that, it wouldn't have resulted so poorly, with player power locked behind them and being forced to make an artificial choice. I'm sure they're aware of this feedback since Shadowlands, so why add a similar hard-stuck quote-unquote option again? So I can definitely confirm that they are aware of this feedback since Shadowlands, because it was my job to make sure that they were aware of that feedback during Shadowlands. So that message was definitely received on multiple steps. And that's why eventually they did make it so that you could switch between Covenants relatively easily. That said, there's a few important distinctions between Covenants and hero talents that I think are important to really clarify here. First of all, hero talents are purely gameplay. There's basically no story involved in it. It's not like you're choosing a set of, at least a current in the War Within Alpha, it's not like you're choosing a set of hero talents and then you go off to like the, I don't know, the Hellcaller class hub and you get to do a whole bunch of Hellcaller quests, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in game that's like story focused and lore focused around Hellcaller. It's literally just you are selecting a talent tree, and the gameplay of it is you get all these talents, and then that's just some adjustment to your class. The comparison here would be if in Covenants, in Shadowlands, if the choice of player power was completely separated from choice of Covenant, to the extent that you would be able to go and choose whichever Covenant you wanted to do as far as your story went, and then just the player power was a different thing that you could select. So the big distinction is you are not, when you're choosing your hero talents, you are not choosing how your experience through the War Within storyline is going to go. You're not choosing which of these groups of people you like the most, which of these groups of people, which of these hubs you want to hang out in all of the time, what set of daily quests you want to be doing. You're not choosing anything like that. You're literally just saying which set of talents is the one that I would like to choose. Now, obviously, to some extent, there are going to be people who are like, well, I want to be a Dark Ranger, but I actually like the, I don't know, pack leader talent choice more, so I'm going to do that one instead. I actually don't know if there must be a spec. It's probably survival that can do both of them. Anyway, there's going to be someone who's like, I want to be a Dark Ranger, but the pack leader is the more fun gameplay for me, so I'm going to step away from the lore of calling myself a Dark Ranger and instead choose the pack leader talent spec. And that's like, I get the frustration that can come from that, but at the very least, it's not like you are then exploring the entire story of Dark Rangers and feel like you don't get to ever find out, you don't get to hang out with the Dark Rangers, you don't get to do anything like that, because that just doesn't exist. That isn't something that's going to occur. Again, at least at this point in development for the War Within Alpha, that doesn't look like something that they're doing. This is literally just a choice of player power. Now, as to why it needs to be a choice of player power in the first place, I think that's ultimately just kind of the point of the whole system. Like what Blizzard set out to do with hero talents was say, okay, we want to give you some further progression for your character in some way. We want you to be, as you're leveling up through the War Within, we want you to have something that you're earning as you're leveling up, but we don't want to add a whole bunch more to the talent trees. We don't want to add a whole bunch more just baseline abilities and so on, like they used to do way back in the vanilla days. They just wanted there to be something that was a way for you to get some kind of progression as you were leveling, so that leveling felt impactful and you felt like you were becoming stronger as you were leveling up, without it being some like huge, like permanent, constant addition to the class as a whole. And that's part of why I really like, I was talking about this in my video in this week's Sounds Good Makes Sense that came out just a few days ago. Part of why I really like the hero talent system is because I think it's the sort of thing where they can add more hero talent specs as time goes on. And it might be the case where it's like, yeah, new expansion is coming out. And rather than needing to add like, well, we added 10 more talents last time. Now we need to add 10 more talents again. Now we need to add 10 more talents again until you end up with the Path of Exile talent tree as the way that World of Warcraft works. They can add these separate options and you can still go choose some of the old ones if you want. But maybe there could be some new choices to make, a new sets of these, 11 talents that you can choose between in order to go on with this and have a little bit more longevity to the system without it being something that becomes super inflated and confusing and difficult to balance in the future. So that's a big part of why I like the system as a like mechanical choice and as a gameplay specific choice. It's very different from the Covenants in Shadowlands because you're not choosing a story. You're not choosing who your friends are. You're not choosing like where do you align. Remember, Shadowlands was very much set up, especially at release. It was very much set up as you're going to level up, you're going to meet these 4 covenants, and then you're going to pick the one that your character most closely aligns with, and that is now your character's identity. There was a whole ton of story and lore that went into that, and a huge part of that dichotomy that came up was people saying, I really identify with Maldraxxus. That's the story that I want to be exploring. But the Fey, God, what was it called? I always blank on the name of the like fairy tree Shadowlands area. I forget what it's called. But they might say that one was like this happened to me as a monk, actually. I really enjoyed the Maldraxxus storyline. I really enjoyed the other one, the vampire guys. I'm apparently just not remembering Shadowlands zone names today, Covenant names, etc. It's just it's gone away in the wind from my mind. I enjoyed the storylines of both of those zones much more than the other zones, much more than the Bastion or the Fairy area. But I felt like as a monk, I needed Feline Stomp because Feline Stomp was really good. And yes, Bone Dust Brew was also kind of good, but Feline Stomp was the ability that I had the most fun playing with. So I ended up choosing that Covenant, even though the story and the focus around the other ones was more attractive to me personally as a player. That's not the case with hero talents. You're not choosing what story you're getting in the War Within by choosing one hero talent set over the other. The other aspect is that you can switch hero talents at any point. Like you can literally just swap them at any time you feel like it. And it's not like you're making individual choices. Well, not too many individual choices inside that hero talent tree either. You will get all of them. There are some choice nodes, but those choice nodes tend to be kind of the same concept done in 2 different ways. So you'll probably center up on some of those anyway, just based on your class or whatever it is you're doing at the time. There isn't a problem like there was in Shadowlands, at least early on, where changing covenants was this like multi-week affair that put you behind everyone else. So that's kind of the big thing there. I don't think comparing hero talents to covenants really makes a lot of sense. They're just very, very different systems, and hero talents are purely gameplay. It's basically the point that I was trying to get across there. Sorry, I meandered a bit and forgot half of World of Warcraft in the process. So we're going to move on. Next question from James on YouTube, who says, Dragonflight has the least amount of raid content out of any expansion with only 3 raids, and not one of those raids having more than 9 bosses. Why do you think Blizzard have cut down on the number of raids, and why are the current ones so small? Is it participation, or have they simply realized they can get away with it after WoD and Shadowlands? So first thing I want to say in response to this question is that I haven't been raiding in Dragonflight, so I haven't even really been playing Dragonflight that much. I've been far more focused on things like the War Within Alpha more recently, and also Season of Discovery prior to that. So Dragonflight is something that I cannot speak as an expert on. I don't really know that much about the current landscape of raiding content in Dragonflight. So bear that in mind as I go through what I'm going to make up as an answer to this question, because I do think it's an interesting question. I do have some thoughts on it. But there's entirely possible some things, some like important details that I'm missing about how Dragonflight raiding has been going that might color this a little bit more than what I'm able to provide as someone who has not been raiding in Dragonflight and hasn't really been paying super close attention to the raiding scene in Dragonflight outside of like a couple of world first races that I've been watching here and there. That said, I think there's a lot that's going on here. And this has been something that people have been talking about in World of Warcraft for a long, long time. Basically, anytime a raid tier comes out and it has fewer bosses, or there's like a tier that has fewer zones to it than whatever the previous tier was or whatever happened in the previous expansions, this question comes up. And it is like they're not incorrect. James isn't incorrect here in stating that Dragonflight has the least raid content out of any expansion. Like there's if you look at just the number of bosses, for example, it definitely has fewer than the last couple of expansions. Looking at the number of raid instances is always a little bit weird because, like, for example, technically, yes, BFA had 5 raid instances, but one of them only had 2 bosses in it. So, like, do you really count that as a raid instance? Do you just tack that onto the other raids that were available in time, but it did come out at a different time? Like, it gets a little bit weird trying to make a direct comparison when you get to that point, is basically the point I'm trying to make. But as far as the amount of bosses that are available, sure, yeah, there definitely have been fewer bosses. Like I went through before I started recording this and counted, and yes, there are definitely fewer bosses in Dragonflight than there are in previous tiers. But there are a number of different reasons that might be the case, right? And so I'm just going to list off some of these more as a like thought exercise than me specifically giving like this is what I think they're doing, because like I said, I haven't been raiding in Dragonflight, so I can't speak to that directly myself. But here are some things to think about. Number one, the first thing that immediately came to mind as I was looking through like and watching the world first races and looking through the bosses that are available, I feel like there are fewer like quote unquote filler bosses nowadays. Now, whether or not that's a good thing is somewhat debatable. Like personally, I've always enjoyed having the like, here's a really, really tough fight that's very difficult and very intense, and you're going to have like a lot of time spending progressing on this boss. And then the next fight is pretty easy by comparison. Like I actually think for pacing purposes, if you just have a straight like curve of every boss getting slightly hard, I'm going to do it this way so it makes more sense on your side of the screen. If you just have a straight curve of every boss getting slightly harder all of the time, I actually don't think that's good. I think it's better when you have like, okay, boss, this one's hard, but then it gets a little easier for a couple bosses, and then you have more of like a almost lilting progression throughout it. Just because it feels good to kill a really, really hard boss and then have a bit of a break from that progression wise for a boss or two. It feels good to me. And I'm sure that's still been the case for a lot of progression. I'm sure there's still very much the state of like, yeah, there's a really hard like boss that's like halfway through the raid instance, and the ones after that aren't as hard. But those like quote unquote filler bosses, I'm thinking of bosses like example from way back in the vanilla days, Grobulus in Naxxramas was right after Patchwork. Patchwork was considered to be a very, very difficult encounter back in the day. Nowadays, not so much because he was really just a like mechanics and numbers check. But back in the day, Patchwork was the fight that people were like, oh God, we really have to learn how to play our characters, and we really have to learn how to pump to be able to take down Patchwork. And he was a very difficult like progression blocking encounter for a ton of guilds back in the original release of Naxxramas. And then Grobulus afterwards was more of a like, yeah, as long as you understand these couple of mechanics, you're going to kill Grobulus. Like he was pretty easy by comparison. So a lot of people looked at Grobulus as the like, congratulations on killing Patchwork boss. There have been similar examples, things like Ulduar, for example. There were a couple of bosses, especially right after killing Kolagarn. There was, I want to say Freya on normal mode, like without doing the hard mode of it, was a relatively easy boss right after that. The Cat Lady boss was a relatively easy boss right after Kolagarn. So there was this sort of like ramp up in progression, and then it dipped back down a bit where you could have some easy bosses after some harder bosses. I feel like they've been doing less of the filler bosses. That's potentially one option here. That said, again, I haven't raided in Dragonflight, so this is just me submitting ideas for your consideration. I definitely think that this faded raids thing that they're doing is, I feel like they're trying something with it. I feel like they are looking at the concept of faded raids and being like, can we do that instead of pumping out, like trying to squeeze out another raid tier in the hopes that by doing a faded raid so that, you know, people have something to do still at the very least. There's still some content there, even if it's rehashed content. We put out faded raids so then they could theoretically focus that effort on the next expansion and making sure that the next one is good to go, so that there's presumably some benefit to that. To be clear, I'm saying I think this might be something they're trying, not necessarily I'm saying it's a good idea. Personally, I think myself and everyone, and probably even Blizzard, would agree that having a actual raid tier is preferable to having a faded raid tier. Like rehashed content is just always going to be a second choice compared to brand new content. But producing these things is a thing. Obviously, these raids have become more and more and more of a like process and more of a production to put out. We are long past the days of like, here's a raid and there's some bosses in it, so we just have to build an environment, slap a few bosses down, come up with a couple of mechanics for each of them, and there we go, we're done. That hasn't been the case since like, I don't know, Cataclysm, basically. We're now in a day and age where each of these bosses, they need to have a story behind them. They need to have mechanics and abilities that match that story. They need to have, sometimes there are cinematics that need to be built for the specific boss encounter, things like Sylvanas. There are things that have to be built to go along with all of this. Sometimes those even occur mid boss fight. And a lot of it is more tied into the story of what's going on, which leads me to another point of it's entirely possible they just didn't have more story to tell for Dragonflight. So rather than making up something weird and being like, yeah, and now Jim is here and Jim really doesn't like you. So you gotta go fight Jim now. Like rather than just making something up that's weird and doesn't fit the story. It's entirely possible that they were like, yeah, we'll just do a Fated raid tier and then we can start working on the story for the War Within. Again, you could obviously say in response to that, like, well, why didn't they come up with some more story to make the expansion last longer? Why did they rush straight to the end of the expansion story instead of trying to build something out prior to that? There's lots of like, why didn't they do it this way instead sort of questions to be asked. And those are fair questions to ask. I just don't have the answer to that. I also know that like sometimes a story, like sometimes a book only has 3 chapters. Then that's just because that's the extent of the story to be told. And trying to come up with some other twist or turn in the middle of it is just going to feel awkward and weird. I will say, just as I'm talking and thinking out loud here as I say that, I do miss the days when there was multiple stories going on inside of an expansion. Like even BFA, for example, had that like brief aside where it was like, okay, yeah, now Ajara is here. And this doesn't really have anything to do directly with this battle between Horde and Alliance that's going on. It doesn't really directly have that much to do with Azerite either. It did obviously then end up tying in a whole bunch to the like old god story of Battle for Azeroth that they teed up. But so this isn't a great example of what I'm talking about. But I kind of miss the days when like, yeah, we went to this new continent and here was the first raid. Like we went to Northrend and here was Naxxramas as the first raid. And then it was like, okay, but there's something going on over in Ulduar that has nothing to do with Naxxramas. It had very little to do with the Lich King whatsoever. It was just kind of there as like this secondary side thing. Like there's this other story that's going on. And we made a raid about it. Like I think I would like to see more of that sort of thing starting to occur inside World of Warcraft in general. Not even just as far as raids. I would love to see more of a case where it's like, yes, this is the story for our expansion, but here's this secondary thing that's happening over here. And here's something else that's happening over here. And this doesn't all have to tie into what the big bad is. This doesn't all have to tie into anything. It can literally, like, it's just world building, really, at that point, right? Like, it's just saying, here's a world, and this is what's going on in that world. And you're going to come over here and you're going to check out these Earthen, or you're going to come over here and you're going to check out these Arathi. And they have their own stories going on, and they don't have to tie into the overall arcing big bad. I would love to see more stuff like that generally in World of Warcraft. Getting back to the question, though, a couple other general thoughts that I have on this here. I've talked about things so far like it genuinely takes more effort to produce raids these days than it used to. James asked in the question, like, is it participation? I genuinely do think that participation is part of it. I think Blizzard is starting to realize that nowadays, when they create raid content, they're creating that for a smaller number of players. And I don't think that's like a sign of the death of World of Warcraft or raiding either. I think that's just literally like they've been adding more ways for you to play World of Warcraft over the years. Like Mythic Plus has now become something where a lot of people, that's primarily what you do. You don't like that's been me for the last like 3 expansions. I don't, well, aside from Dragonflight, which again, I haven't really played that much. But throughout Shadowlands, throughout BFA, I was primarily spending all of my time in Mythic Plus because to me, that was giving me the satisfaction of content that was just difficult enough to keep me engaged. But I didn't want to go through all the effort of trying to join an organized raid guild and so on. So Mythic Plus is something that's definitely taken a lot of people away from the raider player base. I think especially looking towards War Within, like if they really do prop up delves as something that is a more casual focus, like just drop in, drop out. Don't have to worry about your schedule. Don't have to worry about difficulties. Just something you can do to slowly progress your character. I think we'll actually see that start to take away from like lower Mythic Plus keys and stuff as well. And they're just different ways to explore and play the game, which I do think has some impact on Blizzard looking at the amount of raid content that they need to produce to keep raiders satisfied. I don't necessarily think that backing away from raid content is a good idea. I'm not saying that like Blizzard should say. I think when you paint too much by the numbers of participation when you're designing a game, you start to run into issues of like, this actually gets back to the first question, like there's not enough people participating in this. So then you just put more and more rewards on it so that more people participate. But like that's sort of dragging people into doing it, and they didn't want to do it in the first place. That's not necessarily something that's like super engaging for them. I don't know, kind of a rambly answer to that question. Again, it's not one that I really felt like I was able to give like my expert thoughts on because I haven't really been playing Dragonflight. But I think there's a lot of reasons why raids might be getting smaller. And who knows? Maybe we'll look into the War Within. Like, as I recall, the first raid in War Within, I think they said it's 9 bosses. I'm actually going to do a real quick Google here. Okay, they did say 8 bosses for Nerubar. So it's about the same size as the Dragonflight raids. It's possible they stick with that 8 boss size. It's also possible that as the first raid in the expansion, that then they will want to make bigger raids further on. Personally, I would like to see larger raids. I think it would be okay to have a couple of fights that they just genuinely put less like effort into making them super interesting, for the fact of like having those sort of like relaxation fights, having those sorts of like, okay, you killed the hard, complicated boss. Now here's a tank and spank. You hit him until he stops moving, and that's the encounter. That's it. I think it's okay to have some of those in there. They don't all have to be the best encounter that's ever been created. It's okay to have some encounters that are just kind of there just to like drop loot and be something to do. I think that sort of stuff is okay. I'm also like genuinely still very curious to see how raid progression in War Within and over this whole World Soul saga is going to work anyway. Just because I think there's still a lot of questions to answer about what they mean by World Soul Saga and 3 expansions tied together. Are all 3 of those expansions still full expansions that are going to last like a year and a half to 2 years? We don't know yet. So we'll see. We genuinely probably won't know that until much later in the War Within life cycle, exactly how that's going to play out. But anyway, that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Once again, if you would like to ask a question for me to answer or attempt to answer here on the show, all you got to do, leave a comment on YouTube, or if you are a subscriber on Patreon, you can head over to patreon.com/Devilore and find the posting for this episode over there. Inside that posting will be a link to a form you can fill out to submit your question. I don't know why I'm doing that as a form. Like, I could just say leave that as a comment on Patreon. I will probably start doing that, but for now, go ahead and use the form. I don't remember why I set that up as a separate form, to be completely honest. I don't remember why I did that. Anyway, that's all from me. Thanks again so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you later.